Hi, I'm Mzansi. You are listening to Farmers Inside Track, proudly brought to you by Food for Mzansi. I am your host, Patricia Tembo, and welcome to episode 537. In today's episode, we'll be looking at how to best manage your livestock during periods of high rainfall. So, of course, this episode is set to be both informative and practical, as we welcome Ernest Makua, who is a livestock technical advisor at the Red Meat Industry Services. Ernest Makua, welcome to Farmers Inside Track. We're glad to have you back on the podcast to share your expertise today. Welcome.
Thank you, Patricia, for inviting us from the Red Meat Industry Services so that we can come and contribute and ensure that the farmers on the ground, they get the information that they need for improving their livestock management.
Definitely. And Ernest, so you are a livestock technical advisor at RMIS, the Red Meat Industry Services, and you're doing, a phenomenal job there. And I know our red meat producers who listen to the podcast are familiar with you. But for those who haven't heard of you and the work you're doing at RMIS, maybe give us an idea of the role you play in the sector.
For those who don't know who Ernest Makua actually is, so I'm actually a livestock technical advisor for the Red Meat Industry Services. This is where I play a key role in advancing sustainable livestock farming practices across South Africa in the red meat value chain. So I work with the farmers under the pillar of inclusive growth in the red meat industry services. Most of my work, it focuses in assisting the emerging farmers on the ground in terms of technical advices like training, like providing them with a specific advice in relation to livestock management. And then I also have some podcasts that we do with the red meat industry, whereby we invite the farmers, also other people within the industry with expertise that they can come and share their knowledge with the farmers on the ground. That is one part of it. But the other part of it that it includes, amongst other things, to work with stakeholders to ensure that we provide them knowledge through farmers' days, through the study groups, and also assisting the farmers with the mobile processing unit that the Red Meat Industry Services has, so that we can assist them on the ground to take their livestock, also to weigh their livestock, so that they can get the better understanding of how important the weight is in terms of the marketing of their livestock. So I work generally with the farmers on the ground. I work with emerging farmers particularly, so that they can have the knowledge. So I focus mainly in training. We call it the transfer of skills and knowledge. We have management trainings and we have skills development trainings that we provide to the farmers on the ground. That is the long and short of it, of what I do for the Red Meat Industry Services and what my role is.
Thank you so much. I'm sure our listeners can hear that you ensure that livestock producers are well-resourced, with the work that you're doing and RMIS is doing. So, a part of that is, being on Food for Mzansi's podcast, where we get to, hear from your expertise on today's topic. We're looking at how livestock farmers can manage their animals during the rainy season. We know recently it has been confirmed that we're going into a La Nina season, which means typically higher rainfall in some of the regions in South Africa. And sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge, with livestock and ensuring animals are healthy and still productive despite the high rainfall. So maybe going into our topic, what are the main challenges that livestock farmers face when it comes to periods of high rainfall?
Just on that, Patricia. So the main challenges that the farmers are facing in relation to rainfall includes, amongst others, the waterlogged grazing lands, the muddy kraals, and also the increased risk of diseases you would imagine on the ground if the farmers in some regions in South Africa whereby there's a high rainfall. And some of them, they may also experience a feed spoilage. So the wet condition can also stress animals and lead to injuries from slipping, like the floor, or if it's slippery, or standing in mud for too long. So in a nutshell, I would say that it's very important for the farmers to prepare for that, because a long-term waterlogging can also kill grasses and lead to bare ditches and erosions. in their camps. So it's very important for them to prepare for that as well. So I will conclude by saying that the mud increase the risk of foot problems like a foot rot and abscesses, and also animals that can slip and injure themselves throughout the season of rainfall. So there is high challenges that are in relation to rainfall that brings to the muddy condition that the animals are kept in.
Definitely true. Thank you, Ernest. And you will touch on all the aspects that you've mentioned now that farmers need to, keep an eye out for. But let's look at the increased risk of diseases, that livestock that occurs during high rainfall with livestock. What are the most common diseases and infections? I know foot rot is, one of the common ones, but maybe talk us through the diseases and infections that livestock animals face during wet weather conditions.
Definitely. So just on that, the most common diseases that we see, and most of the time in my experience that I see during these wet conditions, not only the foot rot, but amongst other diseases, it includes the pneumonia from cold, damp weather and poor ventilations, that especially on young calves. So pneumonia is one of the common ones. And then other diseases includes the worm infestation that is due to the moist grazing. So those are some of the diseases that the farmers may expect, but it depends on the location where you are. It depends on the region, the environment as well. But then most commonly, those are some of the diseases that you may find as a farmer during this tough rainy season. But just to allow to underscore the foot rot, this one is also caused by wet and muddy conditions, and especially if they tend to keep their cattle in conditions whereby the ground is muddy. And as a result, the bacteria may penetrate some of the hoofs and may cause the foot rot on cattle. And then they may start limping, and subsequently that may affect the production or the overall production of the cattle, because they may struggle to move from one area to the other in terms of grazing, and then that may affect the body condition score. And subsequently, if the body condition score is affected, you would know that the conception rate will also be affected. And then overall performance of your herd may be affected because of those small details. So the foot rot is one of the key ones that affect the production if the farmers didn't prepare in advance for these rainy seasons. Those are some of the diseases that most of the area that in South Africa, if they were to experience high rainfall, farmers may be under pressure to ensure that they deal with those diseases.
Quite interesting, that when an animal's uncomfortable, for example, as you've given now with foot rot, they're less likely to eat or, want to get up and, seek out their feed and things like that. I think just like us as well, if you're in an uncomfortable environment, you're less likely to behave and do the things you normally would. So yeah, I think being aware of these diseases, farmers can catch out, potential losses further on. Yeah, by taking notes of these diseases. So you did speak about worm infestations. I think, it'd be quite interesting if you could maybe speak a bit more on how that occurs. I think you said when it's just a very moist environment, it's a good environment for, organisms like that to multiply. So just give a bit more about the worm infestations that can occur.
So the worm infestation, by worm infestation, I meant that remember when they dry some waste, and then there is a good ground for worms to breed. So therefore, you will have cattle starting to have high internal parasite infestation, and as a result, the farmers may have to use medication to ensure that they inject their livestock against internal parasite. That is something that you tend to, or the farmers would have to expect, especially during rainy season, because not only about the worms we're talking about internal parasite, but you also have the external parasites that also breed very well during the rainy season, and the infestation goes high. That means that the farmers will have to have their inputs, especially in terms of dips and your ivomec for fighting the internal parasites, so that they don't have to experience poor production in terms of their herd and so forth. By that, I mean, you may have some worms like wireworm. So all of them that may breed in high rate in terms of that environment, because that encourages them to be in high numbers.
You shared information there on internal parasites and the importance of farmers to the preventative measures. Thinking now, when it's high rainfall, it's also the condition for external, I think you touched on that, external parasites. So vectors, I suppose that's what they're called, like mosquitoes. are there like livestock groups that are particularly affected by like insects like mosquitoes?
Yes, they do definitely get to be affected by that. Remember, mosquito is one of the insects that gets to cause or to spread the virus for lumpy skin disease. So during rainy season, that's why you always encourage the farmers to, at least before the rainy season, maybe during winter season, maybe the last month of winter, that is August, before the rainy season starts, which normally start around September in some parts of the country. So they need to vaccinate against the lumpy skin disease, because if they get to vaccinate against the lumpy skin disease only during the rainy season, the problem becomes that for the vaccine of the lumpy skin disease to be fully effective against the lumpy skin virus, it needs to take about 14 days. And then if you only vaccinate now during the rainy season, the farmers shouldn't be surprised when they see some of their cattle start to have some lumpy skin disease symptoms and so forth, and that is not because the medication is not working. It's mainly because of that they vaccinated very late. So therefore, to prevent against some diseases like your lumpy skin disease, they need to ensure that they put in the vaccine program and they vaccinate prior to rainy season so that they don't have to experience that. But to answer your question, definitely, during this time around, you have the mosquitoes, which they spread lumpy skin virus, which affects the overall production of livestock. So they need to prepare for that in advance so that they don't get to experience this huge loss in terms of production. But not only that, I just want to give also some prevention tips in terms of that. The farmers, they need to ensure that they keep their kraals dry and clean so that we ensure that during this time of the year, they don't get to experience this type of problems. But also they need to avoid overstocking in muddy areas and also regular deworm their cattle, like I said, and also vaccinate their cattle against diseases like your lumpy skin disease and any other diseases that get to be caused by these insects or these viruses or bacteria. But also another important, I'll just mention towards the end, is this issue of shelter. But shelter plays a critical role, especially in small stock. So all those key elements need to be taken into consideration so that in some environment like that, whereby there's a lot of mosquitoes that causes or transmit diseases like or viruses like the lumpy skin virus, at least their head is protected.
You've already touched on the next question I was going to ask, which is biosecurity and, how farmers can strengthen that. You mentioned vaccinating before time. So I suppose if a farmer is listening right now or at the beginning of a rain season, it's late, it's a bit too late, but this information is helpful either way, going forward. So we can then move on to how, a farmer can identify if there is an issue that's linked to high rainfall or, really conditions, damp or wet conditions in the animals' holding areas. What are the signs that a farmer can look out for in their livestock?
Before I go to your question, I just want to highlight some of the points that I think they were important to mention from the previous question in relation to prevention. I think they also need to ensure that they quarantine the sick animals early. That will help a lot in terms of recovery. If one of the animals, they've got diseases or they've got problems in terms of one of the diseases, it could be lumpy skin disease, it could be joint illness or any other of the diseases, so that it doesn't transmit the illnesses or the diseases from them to other animals. But also the other part of it is that they need to disinfect the kraals regularly, but also control movement of animals in between the camps, because some animals can come from the wet areas to unwet areas and spread the viruses. It could be the foot rot virus or lumpy skin virus or whatever virus that is called the wetland. But also they need to also limit visitors and so that they can have that biosecurity in control and avoid equipment sharing with other farms during the wet periods, because that is one of the key transmission of diseases. But to come to your question about the early signs of illnesses that are linked to wet conditions, amongst other signs, it includes the limping or swelling of hoofs that most of the farms are experiencing, especially those ones that I speak to or I work with from time to time. They get to call me, what medication can we use in this period? And the main cause is wet camps. And then other signs, it will be coughing, a nasal discharge or a labored breathing. But in this case, most of the time, labored breathing is caused by pneumonia. So the fever becomes very high. And in some small calves, you may experience some diarrhea, and at some point weight loss as well. Even also this one is also the older cows. So this need to be considered, and the farmers need to look out for these symptoms, especially this period whereby their animals, they spend most of their time in these camps that are very wet, so that they can deal with them early as possible.
Thank you, for that, for sharing the signs, that a farmer should look out for, as you've mentioned. I think you also touched into pneumonia. And what's the respiratory system? I suppose that is one of the, is a clear way if the respiratory system seems to be irritated, as you've spoken about. I'm thinking of, earlier you were mentioning the diseases, to jump back on that. With vectors like mosquitoes, that's when you also get zoonotic diseases now as well. Does the farmer themselves need to be conscious or aware of their own, I suppose, their health when interacting with animals during high rainfall periods? So, for example, Rift Valley fever, I think, is a zoonotic disease that's, carried by mosquitoes. Is that something farmers need to look at as well?
So absolutely. They really need to also be aware of this zoonotic disease. And not only Rift Valley fever, but you also have some diseases like, just running out of my mind. So there's a whole lot of diseases that they need to look out for. They need to protect themselves against them, especially because, remember, it's not only a rainy season, but it's also a calving season. So they need to make sure that whenever they are treating those cattle during this period of time, they protect themselves. They wear the protective gloves so that when they handle the animals, especially, you may find that you are handling these animals and babies during this period of time and you are helping them. They've got some limping legs, or maybe they might have problems from wherever again. But this one, it happens most of the time when the animals are calving and you've got a cut on your hand, and then if the blood from or any fluid from the animals, it moves from the animal to your cut, you may experience some problems. So yes, of course, they need to consult with the vets, depending on the area where they find themselves in, especially because the Rift Valley fever is not found in all the regions. You may find it in some other coastal regions of the country. They need to consult so that they can be cautious in terms of how they handle the livestock, because some vectors, yes, they can bite some animals and then transmit the diseases from the animals to them. And that may affect some of them. They can go as far as affecting their performance in terms of how they go about in life, of keeping kids and so forth. So they need to be wary of those consequences so that they can take precaution measures.
And you've already mentioned that wet conditions increase transmission of diseases. So going into the next question that I have for you, how then can farmers keep their camps dry and comfortable during high rainfall? Because of course, I'm assuming especially farmers who have less access to resources such as shed or covering for the animals, what do they do in those kind of situations?
That is one of the important information that they need to face as farmers. But just to mention few, they just have to ensure that they provide proper shelter or some tree in some instances, so that as in when the rain is raining, ground doesn't get to be too wet, so you extent that the animal, when they spend too long on the ground, it affects the hoofs and the legs, and then you start having problems like the joint illnesses. But they can also use straws or dry bedding in the kraal, so that it gives some sort of like the dry ground for the animals when they walk on the ground, so that the cattle hooves doesn't get to be exposed too wet to surface conditions in some instances whereby they'll have problems with hooves. But they can also try to rotate animals to dry camps if possible, because the camps, you find that they are not the same. I've been to some farms, so you find that you had the same amount of rain, but some camps are better than others in terms of the wetness on the ground and the soil drainage and so forth. Mm-hmm. So they can try to use that also. That can help a lot, especially if you move the cattle from areas whereby the surface is not that wet. But then one other thing that they can do is to try to raise the feeding areas of the ground to keep the feed dry, because one part of it is that you get to have experience whereby the feed is also wet, and once the feed gets to be rotten, the cattle may start having problems like the digestive issues. You have some bloating and so forth. So it's not only about the health in terms of animal sleeping or spending on the wet ground, but it's also about the food itself, because if the feed is wet, it may be not good for consumption for the cattle, but they may be left with no option because that is the only feed they have as cattle. They may consume it, but subsequently they may experience some problems like your disease, your digestive issues, and so forth.
All right. Thank you for also touching on the issue with feed that comes in when it's raining. We're speaking about rainfall now and how farmers can manage the animals and, ensure that they're in dry conditions during this time. But we know in the northern regions or the summer rainfall areas, we get really extreme rain, thunder, lightning, all of that. And in some isolated cases, we've heard of farmers losing their cattle to being hit by lightning, which is very devastating. But there are ways to prevent that as well. Maybe talk us through that.
Yes, yeah, no, that's true, because I also seen some of the animals that in the media. I think that was last day.
Yeah.
One of the farmers lost a whole lot of cattle. But yeah, that's part of life. But for farmers now to prepare against situations like these ones, they just need to keep their animals away from the tall trees or metal fences, because that is an attraction for lightning. When I was growing, my mom used to say to me, do not stand anywhere next to metal, even if it can be the spoon, because you are inviting a lightning. And the trees as well is one of the attraction for lightning. So the animals need to be as far away as possible from the trees, because if anything, they are inviting lightning. And then one other thing, if possible, they have to try to move the animals to shelters or lower grounds, whereby they will be protected from the rainfall itself, but also that will also save them in terms of lightning. But they can also lastly avoid handling animals during storms. It's risky for both farmers and the animals as well, because if you are handling animals during that time, especially those ones who are using the electric products or they are using any metal or anything to touch the animals, that could be inviting for lightning, especially for us as people. For the mere fact that you are touching water during a rainy season, you are inviting a lightning. So by avoiding cattle during that period of time or during that period of rain, you are saving yourself, but you're also saving the animals as well from lightning.
I'm just thinking it's almost counterintuitive though. When you see a tree and it's raining, you want to go under the tree to shelter yourself from the rain. And I don't know if animals also do the same in those cases. So I think that's a tricky one. But as you said, the farmers need to keep the animals away from trees, to avoid situations like that. So, Ernest, looking at the next question that I have for you, when we're looking at the shelters and kraals, you touched on it earlier, with the question as to how to make sure animals stay dry and comfortable. But looking at the infrastructure itself with the kraals, what's the proper way of ventilating and draining and all those things to ensure that it does stay dry or as dry as possible?
That is a very important question as well, because you can also tell the farmers the problems that they may face underground or on their farms, but not give them solution, because then you are just frustrating them. So one of the things that they need to do is to ensure that they unblock their drainage trenches regularly, just to ensure that when there's a high rainfall, the rainwater can quickly, or they can run as fast as possible to the drainage system so that it don't get too stuck on the surface and create much weedy contagion, and that also subsequently affect the hoofs of the cattle. But they can also keep the roofs in good repairs, especially the shelters. They can have the shelters and then ensure that the shelters are repaired so that as and when it rains, which this one is not always possible for beef farmers, but most of the time you find that it's possible for small stock farmers, especially cattle and sheep and goat, but also the dairy farmers, because they also put their cattle under shelter so that they don't get to deal with a lot of stress that affect their milk production. That is the other part of it. But the last part of it, what they can do is to allow the airflow to reduce the dampness and improve the ventilation within their camps, or especially if their cattle, they live under roof, so that the animals also, they can have sort of like the fresh air so that they can to be exposed to too much moist, which may cause diseases, one or two diseases that may affect the whole overall production of the cattle.
coming to the end of this podcast we are having, when farmers, of course, livestock farmers, communal farmers especially rely on grazing, for feed for their animals. When it's raining, high rainfall like this, it might become a concern as to how their animals may feed, because sometimes the fields become waterlogged or muddy. And I think with agriculture, everything interlinked. So now you look at things like soil management and preventing, waterlogged soils. So how can a livestock farmer, I suppose, navigate a situation where the field is waterlogged, maybe even if it's days after it started raining, but the conditions are still wet on the ground? How can a farmer navigate that?
This is one of the one for them to understand. So I would say it's simple, but for the farmers, because they are there working with cattle every day, they may say this is difficult. But one of the measures that they can put in place is to ensure that they rest waterlogged camps to allow the regrowth of grasses. Because if the cattle, they stay for too long in those waterlogged camps and then destroy the grasses, growth and so forth, and then the pasture may not be able to regrow better. And then so that they can go back to their own state of growth and be able to carry those nutrients that are needed by the livestock. That is one part of it. But the other part of it is to use dry or higher paddocks first, so that they can allow for that grasses that are within the waterlogged camps to have enough time to grow. So then now they're giving the pasture enough time to regain their strength. But they can also provide hay or silage if grazing is not possible for the cattle because of too much surface water. And they can also try to rotate camps more frequently to avoid soil damage and hoof problems for the livestock or for the cattle themselves, because it's mostly noticed in cattle, the hoof problems. Those are the measures that they can put in place. Is that you rest the waterlogged camps by allowing the growth, use a dry or higher paddocks first. But finally, you have to rotate the camps more frequently just to avoid the soil damage and the hoof problems that comes with that high rainfall.
And I think we have covered the important things. Of course, there are the nitty-gritties, when it comes to livestock management. But I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to touch on regarding this topic of, high rainfall periods and how farmers can manage their livestock well.
I just want to leave them with proper message, or I'd say an advice, so that they can get to understand the importance of this. So for them, they just have to understand that the heavy rainfall is not just about the land getting wet. It affects every part of the livestock farm, from soil health to animal welfare. Yeah. So planning ahead is very, very key for the farmers. They need to plan ahead. So the farmers need to ensure that they need to plan ahead so that there's proper drainage in their farms, and there's proper disease control, or to say the vaccination program, and the feeding strategies need to ensure that the heads stay healthy, and also to ensure that, but in the absence of that, they may not be able to have their cattle producing as high as possible, or to be able to deal with these diseases as in when it's important to do so. So they need to make sure that they plan ahead of this so that they don't get to be exposed to these problems or these issues, and then have to deal with overall production loss of their heads.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, farmers need to plan ahead when it comes to the rainfall seasons, because there are plenty of resources that farmers can, find weather forecasts or just an idea of what the weather is looking like going into the weeks ahead of them. So making use of those sources. I don't know if maybe you can share any that you are aware of that, can be helpful for farmers, just so they can also plan when they are about to enter into a raining season. Even weather forecasting. So of course, for farmers to pay attention to the news, watch weather forecasts. But in terms of the management, ways to help them with planning in terms of that, if you can share some resources, please.
I have the specific resources, but what I can say to them is from whatever regions that they have found themselves in, especially the emerging farmers, because most of the time, farmers whom are struggling is emerging farmers who don't have the information. But most of the time, you find that the commercial farmers that within the same regions with the emerging farmers, they've got the resources, they know the weather conditions, they've got the resources to know what to expect in future, even though you cannot predict the future 100%. The least they can do is to speak to their neighboring commercial farmers. They have the resources. They've got also the programs in terms of vaccination. in terms of what to vaccinate for, so that you can be ahead in terms of ensuring that when the rainy season starts, you don't have to deal with consequences of disease management like lumpy skin disease and any other disease that is caused by a rainfall. I would say that they need to be aware of that, but also obviously for information purposes, they just need to be glued up. They need to always watch news and also maybe listen to radio, but also go to social media, check your agriculture journals like your Food from Zanzi and any other journals that may have information. Like myself today, I'm being interviewed by yourself so that I can share the information with them. They just need to be glued up. They just need to find information for themselves so that they can manage their livestock better, so that they can remain sustainable in their own enterprises and be able to, maybe if they're emerging, move from emerging to commercial farming. And they can also contribute meaningfully into the formal red meat value chain.
Thank you so much to Ernest Makua, who is a livestock technical advisor at the Red Meat Industry Services. And for more information on this topic, you can definitely visit www.foodforumzansi.co.za. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. That's it from me, Patricia Tembo, our technical producer, Megan van der Vent, and the rest of #Team Food Forum Zanzi. Thank you for listening.